We are now moving to the last section of the morning. We talked about the meso level, we talked about different theories, and we started to use this word, this concept of power, but we haven't really defined it very well yet. And we wanted to spend a little bit of time on that, and then Solomon will actually come back and talk to you about stakeholder analysis. And this first table raised a very good question. Is the stakeholder a key informant or vice versa? Does anybody else want to answer that before we start? Do you have any idea what a stakeholder is and why or why not they might overlap with a key informant? Are they the same thing? Maybe. Okay, depends. Okay, a stakeholder, in very, very simple terms, is somebody who has a stake in the issue at hand. Okay, which means they are affected indirectly or directly by the issue, negatively or positively. Or they are not only affected, but they have some influence on the issue. Okay, so the example I gave was they're building a new dam somewhere, and we need to map out the stakeholders who are directly concerned by this issue. How will livelihoods, how will people's housing, how will they be affected by the construction of the dam? How will workers be affected by it, etc.? Or we're also looking at stakeholders who have an interest, so people who, whatever, the Chinese company that came in to construct the dam, what are their stakes in the topic? So a stakeholder is not, by definition, a researcher category. Could be a development project, often even a business project has to take account of stakeholders. Okay? But we'll come back to that. Let's start off with our first question, which is, what does power mean to you? If you had to define it briefly, what kinds of things do you associate with power, having power? The ability to make decisions? The liberty to make decisions, okay. And where does the liberty come from? Position, okay. So a position, you hold a position which allows you to make certain decisions. What else? Knowledge. Okay, knowledge and background can all be things that people draw power from. But what else is power? How does it make itself felt or seen?
Societal status.
Societal status, absolutely. Okay. So it's something around making decisions. Or what else? Sometimes you're not even making decisions, but you hold power. Socioeconomic background, okay, status again. What makes one person more powerful than the other? Socioeconomic background, social status, what else? Influence, yeah. Okay, so we're going to be looking at sources of power, yeah? So power in health policy and systems research is the capacity, not even decision making, it's the capacity to do something or act in a particular way. Okay? Because we're not defining power per se as having a lot of power. We're just talking about it as a neutral variable. Okay? So if your question of power features anywhere on your diagrams, it is neutral. We should be able to measure the level of power, right? The amount of power somebody has. To direct or influence the behavior or others or the course of events. So power is imposed sometimes in a top-down way. It is negotiated and it is contested. Contested means people will fight back. If power is imposed on them and they're told to do things in a certain way, they may resist. They may contest the power or the source of power. And we're looking at this in the context of health policy agenda setting, formulation, implementation, but also in health systems functioning. In health policy and systems research, the analysis of power focuses on how forms and expressions of power enable or block health systems change or policy implementation, or what kinds of power are implicated in the process. Because you've already mentioned that power can be derived from different sources. Could be just by virtue of your social status. You don't have to be particularly intelligent, but you're up there somehow. We have plenty of those examples, right? It could be by virtue of your expertise, could be by virtue of your fact that you're in a long generation of people who have held power politically. And again, that's an example of not necessarily having to have the credentials to be able to take decisions, but you have power invested in you simply by virtue of your position. Okay, so let's look at different types of power. This is from an article which we would really recommend. I think we've included it on the Moodle. This is a power analysis in health policy and systems research. It's a theoretical article, but it really is a nice, talks you through step by step to thinking about power. So let's look at power dynamics in a specific arena, an example of vaccine distribution during COVID. Yeah? And we're interested in understanding how principles of fair or just allocation of vaccine were compromised by different types of power. Okay? So we know that there was structural power involved. And structural power refers to having resources, capital, usually in the form of money or other kinds of assets, which put you in a stronger position by definition. And we know that there was vast differences across the globe in terms of structural power. Okay? We know that there was also relational power. Okay? And relational power is not, sometimes it is coinciding with structural power, but often it is about who you know and how you know them. Okay? And we also know that the vaccine story, the COVID vaccine story, was a lot about relationships, bilateral and multilateral relationships across organizations, across countries, across pharmaceutical companies, and so on. We also know that in principle, discursive power should have played a role in the vaccine distribution. And by discursive power, we refer to voice. People speaking up because they have the power to do so, and arguing maybe a counter narrative, okay, and saying, okay, we believe that poor countries should be prioritized for X, Y, and Z reason, or this should be evidence-based. So you will remember that maybe in the UK, probably the same thing in India, is that there was a scientific advisory group, an official one set up by the government that was supposed to make policy decisions about all the steps, preventive measures, vaccines for COVID. But in the UK, there was an alternative scientific advisory group. I forgot what it was called. I think it was called it wasn't called the STAG, it was called something else. It had a different name. But it was a group of researchers who strongly believed that the government's positions were not informed adequately by evidence and much more by structural and relational power. Okay? So basically what happened in terms of the COVID vaccine distribution is that we saw that discursive power was just not able to overcome the forms of structural power and relational power that were there among powerful associations, and that led to huge disparities in terms of the vaccine distribution. So let's look at each of those sources of power one by one. So structural power is stemming from the organization and the arrangement of society, institutions and norms that influences who holds authority and how power is distributed. So think about the name itself. Structural power is where are you in the structure? So often it includes formal hierarchies, it includes the biases, race, gender, class, caste, and how they place you somewhere along the ranking. and the design of decision-making processes. It also shapes the context within which individuals exercise influence. It impacts who holds power, how it's shared, who is permitted into the circle of trust, right? So the symbols I've put up there are essentially alluding to that. Often it's about money as the kind of one of the most significant sources of structural power. It is about the level of the organization and where they are in terms of a hierarchy. And it is about your positioning within any form of formal or informal societal organization, social organization. Okay? Relational power is power that's exercised through your interactions and your relationships. So the structural power is just you, how much do you have invested in you by virtue of where you are, who you are, right? The relational power comes because of your relationships with other people. Individuals and groups negotiate, they influence each other. It involves using expertise, persuasive communication, building alliances, leveraging personal connections to exert influence. So very interesting for most of your topics, actually. It really depends, however, on the strength and the quality of the interpersonal relationship. How trustworthy and credible are the individuals within it? Do they trust each other? Yeah. So this is, in contrast to the organogram, this is the social network that we were referring to earlier. And the third form of power is discursive, and we've used the word discourse as a body of knowledge which is shaped formally or informally through discourse, which is how people give meaning to ideas. So this is about how language, ideas, and communication are used to shape perceptions, influence behavior, and in fact manipulate power. Yeah? Discursive power can control the narrative and frame issues in a particular way, using language to legitimize or delegitimize certain ideas or groups. So we see this in the media all the time. That's why you look at the media critically and you say, okay, we see these newspapers are aligned with this political party, or this is left-leaning, this is right-leaning. That's an obvious place where you can see how the media is using discursive power to control or manipulate a narrative. And it can also be used to manipulate desires, internalize norms, and create a dominant worldview. Okay? Not only newspapers, but groups of individuals who feel strongly about an issue, like an anti-vaccine lobby that became quite strong in Europe during COVID. Okay, so this article, the top article that I referred to before, has a very nice framework, which I think is reasonably easy to look at, and as compared to some theoretical frameworks. And their argument is essentially that we cannot conduct research on power in isolation from understanding all those three types of power I mentioned. The actors, the context, the content, the structures, the processes of the policy or systems in focus. So the triangle might for you be reminiscent of the policy triangle in some ways, because they also talk about actors, context, processes, right? But here they break it down a little bit more. So they talk about actor relationships and networks. That is your relational power, right? They talk about sources of power, which is often structural, and they talk about broader societal flows and expressions of power. So this is the sort of driving values. Are you in a country where your emphasis on the health system is that it is efficient versus that it should be equitable? Can you achieve both? That if you think about the US healthcare system versus the Cuban health system, or what the Cuban health system used to be, the values in that health system are driven by the political norms or political discourse. So these are the sort of three anchors in a way to understand and to be able to analyze power. Essentially, another thing which is going to lead us into what Solomon is going to talk to us about is differentiating between ideas and interests. So what is discursive, what is discourse, versus what is structural, and what is what you hold that allows you to wield power. So the ideas are the normative ideas that govern society, and which I have told you are also spill into how we make policies and how we run health systems. So they're principles. They're like ethical principles, right? Equity, justice, beneficence, but also efficiency, rational healthcare, etc. They're also the ones outside the system, the normative, social, religious, gender, etc. And often the ideas drive a particular way of looking at things, right? If we're looking at efficiency, we might really want to use disease burden estimates and economic evaluation to do cost effectiveness studies. So that's just an example of how the strategy may be aligned with a normative view of looking at the system. On the other side, we're thinking about interests, which can be economic, political, or social. And these are often the things that the interests that different kinds of stakeholders in the system have. What is it they want to gain from the initiative? So is it a direct financial gain? Pharmaceutical industry has a stake in the health system because they stand to make money, right? Or researchers have a stake in this topic because they're going to get some professional status from this. They're going to get lots of publications, which means they're going to become a professor, right? Politicians stand from constructing a new hospital in a poor area because they hope that everybody in that area is going to vote for them. Yeah? And social is obviously also connected to that the interests that you're analyzing in terms of who is participating. So again, going back to your topic, why would private providers participate in the partnership? What are the non-financial interests or incentives that would drive people to participate in this? Okay, we're going to move on from this to stakeholders and conducting a stakeholder analysis. And just to remind you, it is moving away from the idea of key informants in a research topic to understanding power in the system. And to understand power, you need to locate everybody who's affected by the intervention or the system or the initiative that you're putting in place. And you need to assess and see what types of power they wield and how they're connected. And that's what Solomon is going to do.
Right. Thank you, Karina, for setting the tone for the stakeholder analysis. I think there were some questions around key informant interviews and stakeholder analysis. So for now, I would like to let you know that some of your key informants will be your stakeholders, but not all your stakeholders would be your key informant. Because in stakeholder analysis, we are looking at people who will be supporting the policy or the program, or people who might be influenced and they may not be supportive, and so on. So we'll try to spend another 30 to 40 minutes on trying to understand what a stakeholder analysis is. But just to begin with a small question, like what comes to your mind when we say stakeholder analysis? Bureaucrats? And why bureaucrats? Okay, so they play a role in policy formulation. Okay. Anybody else?
Anyone who has a direct or indirect impact in the policy making or decision making can be called as a stakeholder.
Okay, anybody who has a direct or indirect way in policy making. Okay, that's good. Example?
People can be one of the stakeholders. They are not part of this policy making, but they affect the making of the policies.
Right.
And a policy maker is a direct part of the policy making.
Right. Any other last response?
At the level of policy makers or implementers or can be beneficiaries also can be taken as a stakeholders.
Okay. Yes. Fine. Great. Okay. So when we talk about a stakeholder analysis, it's basically a process to identify and assess the influence, interest, and impact of stakeholders on a project decision or organization. It aims to manage and engage stakeholders effectively to ensure project success. So basically in public health, when we talk about stakeholder analysis, it is basically to engage them to help inform planning and implementation of health innovations. So we can think of doing a retrospective policy analysis as we looked into Saturday class, okay? You can go back and look at how a particular policy was formed and analyzed. So retrospectively also you can think of engaging with the stakeholders and trying to understand like how did the whole policy thing got shaped, like whose power made a difference and so on. But more usefully, it is also prospective in nature. For instance, if you want to launch a new policy, or if you are aiming, or your research work is aiming to bring in some policy recommendations or new evidences that will contribute to reshaping of the policy, then you would be more interested in understanding like who will be the potential people who would support or oppose your initiatives. Now there are a variety of approaches that have been discussed in this very interesting paper, how to do or not to do a stakeholder analysis. Okay. But there are three distinct activities that can be identified. One is identifying the policy actors. Second, assessing their political resources. And thirdly, understanding their position and interest with respect to the issue. Now, so far as the stakeholder mapping process is concerned, you can start with identifying stakeholders, then you analyze their interest and influence, and then you categorize stakeholders using different tools. For instance, one of the tools that is commonly used is the power interest grid. And then you engage stakeholders with meaningful dialogues, having communication, different communication strategies, and so on. Now, when you talk about identifying stakeholders, it is basically listing all individual groups or organizations that have an interest or can influence the project. So later in the day, what we are going to do is all these different case studies that you are engaged with, we are going to ask you to list the possible stakeholders from your case study point of view. We want to understand, like, based on your study, hypothetically tomorrow if you think something needs to be contributed at the policy level, then in that case, like, who would be your potential stakeholders? So identifying stakeholders. So basically, as we have heard it before also, they could be people, groups, institutions with interest in the project or program at different levels, target government, private sector, NGOs, individual communities, and so on. Now, one thing we need to be cautious about here is stakeholders will be specific to the particular policy and the context within which it is been discussed. Now, someone who might be a stakeholder for a particular study may or may not be the right stakeholder for another issue or another policy that you are dealing with. So, identifying stakeholders who are or might become involved in a particular policy process requires the judgment of the analysis. So, you as a researcher, you as an analyst will have to think through in terms of mapping and listing the process. And that's why we always talk about you list out. You prepare a list of who could be your potential stakeholders. Now, there are three types of stakeholders which one could think of. The first is the primary stakeholders. These are the ones who are directly impacted by the project or the policy decisions made. Customers, employees, or investors. Then we have a group of secondary stakeholders who are indirectly affected. This could be local communities, suppliers, or NGOs. And in addition to these, we also talk in terms of the key stakeholders. individuals or group with significant influence, executives and government bodies who can significantly influence your decisions, who can significantly shape the way things are going to move on. Now, there is an interesting paper, and I'm pretty sure you will gain a lot from this paper. We are going to share the link with you. This paper is talking about stakeholder analysis for hypertension management in the context of Indian public health system. The interesting part about this paper, what I liked is the way they have operationally defined what stakeholder means for them. What power means in this study. What does interest means in the context of this study. So, stakeholder, what they have said is anyone interested in hypertension management who is affected by hypertension or who because of their position have or could have an active or passive influence on the decision making and the implementation processes. Now, if I say there is a stakeholder who is more interested in the public-private mix policy, will that stakeholder become important in this context? Absolutely not. Because out here we are looking for a stakeholder who has an interest, who has a stake in hypertension as a phenomenon, hypertension as a public health problem. And that's why, going back to our previous slide, when you select or when you choose our stakeholders, as an analyst, we need to understand whether that person has a say or stake in the policy that we are studying. Power, the potential ability of the stakeholder to affect policy implementation. Now it is a matter of analysis, and power and positions are kind of intertwined. So we are going to look at how the power grid is worked, how people map out once they list out their stakeholders. Now what we have seen is the listing part. So position, how strongly the stakeholder supports the policy implementation. Interest, the extent to which stakeholders perceive policy implementation as relevant and likely to affect them. Similarly, they define what enabler would mean in their context of the study, what barrier would mean. So anybody interested in doing a stakeholder analysis will have to operationally define who the stakeholders are and what these different concepts would mean in the context of your study. So this is how they have listed their stakeholders. Starting from policy makers and program managers, and then they have listed all different, organizations, different ministries who would contribute or who would be have some kind of stake in it. Then they're talking about development partners and civil society organizations, then academia and research, healthcare providers, and of course the beneficiaries, because they are the ones who are going to be impacted by the decisions of the program and the policy. Getting an idea? So in the process of stakeholder analysis, the first crucial step is you identify your stakeholders. You list them down. Okay, without even thinking, whatever comes to your mind, because now you have a well-laid structure, people are talking about macro, meso, and the micro level. Think across your case studies later in the day and see who could be the potential stakeholders, who would either benefit or who would have an adverse impact or who would have an interest or stake in their policy. Once we do that, the second stage is assessing power. Karin has already set the background. We have got an idea of what power means. Okay, so political resources take many forms but can be divided into two. It could be tangible or it could be intangible resources. Votes, finances, infrastructure, members, or intangible resources could be expertise and legitimacy in the policy issue. Access to media and political decision makers. Now, access to these resources increases stakeholders' influence in the policy process. Now, example, groups with a developed organization and infrastructure will often have more power than groups which have yet to be organized themselves. If you're thinking about one of your list is say you're talking about public-private mix as a study. You will say like, okay, at the district and the state level, there are stronger medical associations. Okay, they are already formed, they are already functional. So their power or their influence would be greater than someone who is like less organized, who doesn't have an infrastructure. Similarly, doctors have relevant expertise, legitimacy in civil society. So they are high status, frequently have access to financial resources and decision makers. So doctors are considered to be very legitimate within the community. Okay. And by the virtue of their profession, many people access their services. So they, as a part of their services, come in contact with people who are actually decision makers. So pharmaceutical companies have great expertise, considerable finance, but often limited legitimacy in civil society. So when we talk about assessing power, we look at like all these different kinds of tangible and intangible means and resources people have access to. Then the third stage is assessing interest, positions and commitment. Now each actor's interest, position and commitment to a particular policy issue will determine how actors will deploy their political resources. Somebody might be very much interested in your policy but has no position in the system. Somebody might be at a very high position but at all not interested in the issue or in the topic that you are working on, not interested at all. So his interest, position and above all his commitment will determine how will they use their political or power resources. Now when it comes to interest, these are those which benefit an individual or a group as distinct from wants or preferences. What do stakeholders want? So list of common interests: financial returns, regulatory compliances, brand reputation. So definitely they will have some kind of a stake in what you're doing. So they might talk about their interest areas within that. How will stakeholders be affected? Consider potential benefits or losses for each stakeholder. Will it affect his position? Will it challenge his position if he shows more of an interest in your policy study? Similarly, the position and commitment. The impact of an issue on stakeholders' interest will determine their position with respect to their proposed policy, whether they are supportive, neutral, or opposed. See, the study that you're doing or the issue that you are undertaking as a part of your policy analysis, if it interests the stakeholder, okay, it will determine his position with respect to the proposed policy. Now, the position in terms of like whether his position as a supportive position or his position as a neutral position or his position as an opposing position. For example, a minister may publicly support a policy so as to win favor with voters or specific interest group, but may be actively working against the policy from within government. Okay. Now, if you read through news articles, you will many times come across, like policy decisions or announcements that are randomly made by political leaders. So on the forefront, they might show interest in the issue. That's the problems team, you could say. They might attach their political will with that problems team. But inside, within the organizational setup, they may not really be interested in working with you. Now, what are the tools for stakeholder analysis? So one of the tools that is most commonly used is the power interest grid. Has anybody come across this ever? Power interest grid? Yes? Okay. It looks something like this. So it's a 2x2 box, 4 boxes. Like the first box is about high power and low interest. The second is about high power and high interest. Low power, low interest, and the fourth one is the low power and high interest. Okay, so what does it mean? So this is how a power interest grid looks like. So on one side of the axis you have power and the other side of axis you have interest. Low to high, low to high. So now tell me from this table, who would be the people who would be more influential from the policy analysis point of view in your issue or the study that you're doing? Which would be the group you would be more interested in, or would like to or would be in a position to support or influence your policy decisions? High power and high interest. Exactly, because these are the stakeholders and decision makers. They have the biggest impact on the project. Okay, success, and hence you must closely manage their expectations. So they are the people with whom you have to work closely, manage them closely. Unka ego hurt nahi karna hai, kind of thing. Okay, you have to see to it, like you have appropriate communications with them. Okay, keep them updated with all the things, seek their suggestions. So these are project sponsors and executive. Then you have another category with high power but low interest. Now these are the stakeholders needed to be kept in the loop. Why? They are not interested, but you still need to keep them in the loop. For the reason? Because they have high power. They are not interested. They have high power, they can even block your initiatives. Okay? So they need to be kept in the loop. These stakeholders need to be kept satisfied even though they aren't interested, because they yield power. These types of stakeholders should be dealt with cautiously as well, since they may use their power in not desired way in the project if they become unsatisfied. Kind of government regulators. Okay. Then there is another level where you have people on the high interest side, but so far as the power is concerned, it is very low. Okay. You should keep them informed. Further, because they are interested. They may not be able to do anything out of the way for you because they don't have high power. Okay. But they have high interest. Okay. Who knows, by the time your project comes to an end, they might get promoted. Okay? You started your study in the month of Jan, and by the time your proposal is sanctioned, your funding has arrived, this person is promoted to a higher position. So he was already interested in your project, and now he has taken a high power role. Okay? So keep these people adequately informed and talk to them to ensure that no major issues are arising. These people can often be very helpful with the detail of your project. The community members, or even people within the ministry itself, at what level you are looking at. Okay, since they are also people with high interest, they will contribute to your research ideas. They will contribute to your interest. They will give you suggestions based on the topic or the policy issues that you are dealing with. And then you have one group which is low group kind of a thing. Okay, so you monitor them. Minimum effort, because low interest, low power. Monitor these people, but do not bore them with excessive communication. Okay, they are distant suppliers. But also be cautious about this group. Why? They are not interested. But in the 6 months time period, they are also likely to get promoted and their power might gain. And already they are not interested. Okay? So once they take on the power role, they might come into this box of keep satisfied. They can even block your initiatives. So when you identify your stakeholders, that first level of list, the second exercise is that you think through in terms of these boxes. Who is sitting where? In terms of this position. Who could be the potential people who might block your initiatives, or who might be the people who can support your initiatives? So this power interest grid helps us in doing that. So look at this political analysis of health reform in Domitian Republic. They use this power guide, power grid to map their stakeholders. For example, if you look at the neutral position, you will find it is university beneficiaries, National Health Commission, church, press people. But look at the Office of Technical Cooperation, it's on the higher side. They are the people who will highly support, and they are the one who carry high power. Okay. NGOs are still falling in terms of the position. NGOs are lower, okay, and even the power is lower, but there is a possibility that in their study they thought like NGOs would be opposing their initiatives. High power private clinics, employees in the organized sector, but opposition wise they saw it on the higher side. Okay, getting an idea? Okay, let's look at another example. So this was another study that was done as a stakeholder analysis of COVID-19 management and control in Iran. So this study aimed to identify and analyze the actors and stakeholders related to managing and controlling the pandemic in Iran. What they did, a total of 48 stakeholders were identified. Ministry of Health, National Headquarters for Coronavirus Control had the highest participation level, high supportive position and knowledge of the subject. The Parliament of Iran, Islamic Revolutionary Guard groups and Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting had the highest power influence during COVID-19. Only 2 stakeholders had high participation and 18.8% had moderate participation. So all stakeholders except for the NHCC and the MOH lacked appropriate knowledge of the subject. So this is how they tried to use the power interest grid to understand that. So keep satisfied, then the key players who are on the higher side in terms of both the efforts, then the keep informed minimal efforts and the keep satisfied category. So maybe later in the afternoon when you list your stakeholders, at least think about this particular grid and at least two people, at least 2 groups you could think in terms of to map out in different boxes, and if at all, then who could be those people. In addition to power grid, people can also use interviews and survey as a method to understand stakeholder perceptions and their support systems. Okay, so this was a stakeholder engagement in the health policy process. So this study explored the extent of how stakeholders would support the process. A qualitative study was designed. Interviews were conducted with 19 representatives of organizations operating at the local level such as CSOs and the local government, and open questions were asked about experiences and perception of the development of national health policy. 2 inductive contact analysis was performed. So power grid is one of the tool. Of course, the next tool is interviewing people. Most of us will be engaged in doing so. Now going back to the first example that I showed you, what they did is they prepared an annexure tool and they sent it to all their stakeholders, okay, to map out their power, position and interest. And they asked them to grade it. We request you to kindly score the power, position and interest using any digit from 0 to 100 in such a way that the summation of the tool scored for each stakeholder is 100. Okay. So they approached each and every one, all of that list. Okay. They sent it and they asked them to score themselves. This is how they analyzed it. And interestingly, what they showed is like, our study shows that the stakeholder representative considered policymakers and program managers to possess the highest power, position and interest in hypertension management. Can you see it from this table? Okay, it's like 23.3%, 25.4, 22.1, the scoring that they have given, okay, based on the analysis, okay. Similarly, our study shows that the beneficiaries are perceived to have the lowest power and position, but have fair levels of interest in ST management. So 19.4. So on the power and position side, beneficiaries are on the lower scale, but they have more interest, okay, and can fall into our last grid where they are low power but high interest. Okay. Another table, what they did in addition to this is they also used the WHO's 6 building blocks and wanted to understand like their preferences in terms of like what would be the block they would be more interested in when it comes to the support system. And what they found is like the service delivery is considered to be the top enabler, okay, as well as the barrier. Similarly, it showed that the health workforce was the major barrier in the STN management. Studies from L12 identified workforce related barrier as the most important factor hindering the services. See, any study, we all are into public health research. Any study you do, you talk about your road traffic accident, you talk about your PPM TB, you talk about digitalization of ASHA, you talk about the CHOs. And you go to the field, every stakeholder is going to talk about lack of workforce. Okay, workforce is a challenge. Okay, we are running short of human resources, and this is how like this article has wonderfully tried to list their stakeholders, put them in the power grid, try to understand that what are their power positions, and then based on the scoring, they did this analysis and helped us understand that yes, policymakers and program managers would be more interested in the service delivery component. Okay, so this is how stakeholder analysis is done. And once you do that, you come to the fourth stage, that is the engagement strategies, that is developing tailored communications and plans. So different stakeholders require different approaches. People with high power and high interest, you need to talk to them directly. There has to be frequent communications with them. People with high power and low interest, you keep informed but minimally engage them. Low power and high interest, you ensure their voices are heard and even if they have less influence. So building relationships, so continuous relationship management is the key to keeping stakeholders on your side. Now, why stakeholder analysis is important? First, it helps in prioritizing stakeholders, because if you don't do it, if you don't do the listing, if you don't do the mapping, if you don't do the power grid, whatever program you're undertaking, whatever policy you want to look forward as a contribution to the new policy, okay, it will be very difficult for you to do it because you will not know who are the right people who will support or who are the people who can even block your policy initiative. So ensure resources are directed to stakeholders with the greater influence. It improves the decision making. It provides insights on how to handle different stakeholder groups, okay, because that grid that we have lit it, keep informed or high power, high interest, you manage them closely. So it gives you a framework in terms of how you need to handle different stakeholders. Minimize risk, reduces the likelihood of conflicts and misunderstanding. You never told us this before, otherwise we would have supported you. Now don't come to us for permissions, we won't be helping you out. Okay, so it also reduces the chances for conflicts and misunderstanding. Enhances communication, identifies appropriate communication strategy for each stakeholder. It gives us the opportunity, okay, because not every, as we have seen on the previous slide, not every stakeholder will have to use the same strategy. So we'll have to work out different communication strategies. Helps in assessing the project environment. Draw out the interest of the stakeholders at the project identified stage and identify conflicts of interest between stakeholders. So it is not only about their own positions but also the challenges that are there within the different sets of stakeholders. I would like to just share one example, like almost I think 2 decades ago, like we were doing this project in one of the southern states where we wanted to build a partnership model for HIV TB co-infection management. And there were these two programs, vertical programs that we were looking for. One was the TB program and the one was the HIV program. And one day we tried approaching the HIV stakeholders. The other day we tried approaching the so-called high-profile TB people stakeholders. But that was the time when TB and HIV program were working so much in isolation, they didn't want it to come in together. For various reasons, there were certain conflicts of interest across both the stakeholder groups, and despite of like the study results that we were showing, we didn't have buyers and takers of those findings. We couldn't implement the program and couldn't transfer that that initiatives and that findings to the program level because there was a block at the level of particular stakeholders. Common challenges in stakeholder analysis: identifying all stakeholders. Some stakeholders may not be obvious at first. Sometimes in the process of listing, okay, we might think, okay, this person is the director of this particular institution and he should be our stakeholder. But who knows, there is somebody who is assisting him. He has actually a major role in that whole process, okay? And so identifying all stakeholders is not an easy task. Conflicting interest: balancing diverse stakeholders' needs and priorities can be difficult. You cannot keep everybody happy, okay? Or you cannot make everyone happy, but you will have to balance it out as researcher. Evolving stakeholder landscape: stakeholders' interest may shift throughout the project. It may happen, okay, interestingly, that at the beginning you might draw a table saying that whose position is where, and 10 people are supporting you, 5 people are not supporting you. Okay, this might be a barrier to you, they might create difficulties for you. But over the time their position might change. Somebody who is high in power and not interested eventually might get interested in your subject. Somebody who has been high power and shown high interest initially, his interest might even come down in the, so that landscape is never permanent, and one needs to be cautious in terms of like when we are interacting with stakeholders. And finally, to conclude, stakeholder analysis is essential for effective project management and organizational successes. Identifying and understanding stakeholder interest, influence and power helps create targeted strategies. Regular engagement and communication are vital to maintain positive relationships. So stakeholder analysis, whether you are interested in a retrospective way of looking at the policy implementation, or you're looking at a prospective policy analysis, wants to contribute in a new way to the policy, you can use stakeholder analysis, as it is one of the most useful tool for project management and organizational success. It provides a different way of looking at your stakeholders. It helps you understand their power and positions and map it out across their interest levels. So this is so far as our stakeholder analysis is concerned. And later in the day we have like number of group activities for you. So we will try to reduce it to a couple of activities, but we definitely want you to give a thought to it. Go back to your case studies. I'm pretty sure you must have already started thinking in terms of your case studies that who would be my potential stakeholders, but we just don't want the list of the stakeholders. We also want you to think it across that power grid and say, like, even if you could map at least 1 or 2 stakeholders in each of those boxes, I would say that you have got a grasp of like what stakeholder analysis is. Well, with that thing, I will stop here now, okay, and then we can open it for the discussion. Yes, thank you.